Welcome back to So You Really Want to Learn Latin, and today we are going to be doing a little bit more on gerundives. Now, we have done gerunds, and we have recently come across a little fellow called the gerundive, and we've been very careful not to confuse our gerunds with our gerundives. Now, last time we looked at a thing called the gerundive construction. And you'll remember that was when we wanted to avoid the situation where a gerund might have been trying to govern a direct object. And if you remember when that happened, we introduced this little fellow called the gerundive, which has this meaning of to be loved, or to be warned, or to be ruled. And we ended up saying things like desirous of ruling the city, okay, and we ended up spinning that to saying desirous of the city to be ruled. Cupitus orbis regendi. Well, what we're going to do now is move on and have a look at something called the gerundive of obligation. And the gerundive of obligation is where we describe a situation as being something that ought to be done. So, for example, if you wanted to say the city ought to be attacked, okay, the way you do that in Latin is you say urbs, and then you use a gerundive in agreement with the thing that ought to be whatevered, with a part of the verb to be. So the city ought to be attacked. What you actually do is you say the city is to be attacked using a gerundive. So urbs oppugnanda est. Okay? Oppugnanda, it's quite a hard word to say that. Oppugnanda is the gerundive of oppugno, to attack. It's in agreement with the city, which is nominative and feminine and singular. And then we've just added the present tense of the verb sum, and we get est. Oppugnanda est. Urbs oppugnanda est. The city is to be attacked. In other words, the city ought to be attacked. And if you wanted to say the city ought to have been attacked, it ought to have been attacked, but it wasn't, then what you do is you say the city was to be attacked. You just change the tense of the verb to be. And you go, urbs oppugnanda erat. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now, a few little things to add to that. If there is an obligation on someone, so if you wanted, for example, to say the city ought to have been attacked by the general, okay, now the obligation was on the general. The person on whom the obligation falls goes in the dative case, okay, so that would be urbs oppugnanda erat, by the general, imperatori, okay, dative case of imperator. Now, that sounds a bit peculiar, because you might have been thinking, well, why wasn't it in the ablative? Well, it's because there was an obligation put on the general, so it's sort of explained by that. Now, as you'd expect, there's sometimes a bit of scope for confusion. So if you wanted to say the book ought to be given back to me by you, okay, we would say liber mihi redendus est, okay, so that's the book to me is to be given back, redendus est, and then we want to say it ought to be given back to me by you. Now, the obligation would normally go into the dative. The person on whom the obligation lies goes into the dative. But in this situation, we've already got a dative because we're saying the book ought to be given to me, and now we want to say by you. So we can't put you in the dative as well, because otherwise it would be chaos. You know, the book ought to be given to you, to me, I mean which. So in that case, we use R plus the ablative, and we would have said arte. Okay, but generally that doesn't happen, and therefore just remember the person on whom the obligation falls goes in the dative case. And just one final thing, note that with intransitive verbs, okay, remember an intransitive verb is a verb that cannot govern a direct object in the accusative case. Okay, an example of that would be kuro. Okay, I run. You can't run anyone. In English we say I run a race, but we don't mean that. We mean we run in a race. Okay, so kuro is an intransitive verb. If you wanted to say I ought to run, okay, you can kind of hear the word ought and you think, ooh, a gerundive of obligation would be nice here. But, you know, how would you do it? Because kuro is an intransitive verb. And what you end up doing is you bung it into the neuter, and you kind of use the word it as the subject of this construction, and you end up saying currendum est mihi. Okay, so that's kind of, it is to be run, and then mihi, remember the obligation lies on the person in the dative, so it is to be run by me. In other words, I ought to run. Okay, bit peculiar when explained like that, but when you see it in Latin, I think it would be much more obvious. And in fact, we've got another example in the book here. We are in chapter 9 of the book. We've got Romanis cum hostibus pongnandum est. Okay, so pongnandum est, it is to be fought. Romanis, they're in the dative, so that's where the obligation lies. It is to be fought by the Romans, cum hostibus, with the enemy. Okay, in other words, the Romans ought to fight with the enemy. Okay, now, best way to test that we've got all of that, both the gerundive construction and the gerundive of obligation, is to have a whack at putting some of these into Latin. Okay, so we are going to have a go at exercise 9.5. We'll just do a few of these, and you can do the rest on your own. So if we begin with, the ramparts were suitable for hindering the enemy. Okay, now the trick with these is to work out what construction we're going to be using. Are we using a gerund? Are we using a gerundive construction? Or are we using a gerundive of obligation? And you have to get your head around which of those it is we're going to be using and then follow it through carefully. So, the ramparts were suitable for hindering the enemy. Now, it should immediately be obvious there that for hindering the enemy, hindering looks like it's going to want to govern the enemy, and for the enemy to be the object of that sort of verbal notion, hindering. And if you remember, we don't like using a gerund in that situation. Okay, so we're going to be flipping it, and therefore we're going into the gerundive construction. And we're going to end up saying that the ramparts were suitable for the enemy to be hindered. Okay, do you remember that's how we do a gerundive construction? We kind of flip it around. Okay, so the ramparts, Latin for a rampart is valum, it's a neuter noun. So vala, nominative plural, were suitable, apta erant, so vala, apta erant, and then for the enemy to be hindered. Now, for the enemy, ad hostes, right? And then to be hindered impediendos. Okay, that is the gerundive of impedio, which goes like audio. It's in the accusative agreeing with hostes. Ad hostes impediendos. The ramparts were suitable for the enemy to be hindered. Okay, so number 2. We came to Rome for the sake of seeing the temple of Jupiter. Again, you can hear this of seeing the temple. You know, that word seeing is looking to govern the temple as its object. And when that happens, we don't want to use a gerund. We want to use a gerundive construction. Okay, so Romam venimus, we came to Rome. And what we're going to say is, for the sake of the temple of Jupiter to be seen. Okay, so don't worry too much about the word order, but we're going to say for the sake of seeing the temple. Templi Iovis, okay, so that's of the temple of Jupiter. Causa, right, for the sake of, and then to be seen, videndi. Okay, so Romam venimus templi Iovis videndi causa. Okay, so you see what's happening there? And we'll just do one more, I think. Number 3, the Gauls were lying down, tired from running through the streets. Okay, so the Gauls, Galli, were tired from running, you know, the art of running. Correndum is running, and so correndo would be from running or by running. So Galli, feci correndo pervias, they were lying down, jacebant. So you might go Galli pervias correndo feci jacebant. The Gauls were lying down, tired from running through the streets. Okay, and we'll do some going the other way. We've got a little fellow called exercise 9.6. I'll just home in on number 6. Accies in campo imperatori instruenda erat. Okay, accies, the battle line. In campo, on the plain, imperatori instruenda erat. Okay, the battle line was to be drawn up on the plain, and then who by? Imperatori, by the general. And notice that general is in the dative case because the obligation falls on the person in the dative. Okay, and we'll do another one. Number 10. Urbs illis consulibus unum annum regenda est. The city regenda est is to be ruled illis consulibus by those consuls unum annum for 1 year. So the city is to be ruled for 1 year by those consuls. Okay, and that's a gerundive of obligation. Okay, so they're great fun, these little fellows. You can't really beat them. We've got gerunds, we've got gerundives, and gerundives being used in 2 different ways. In a gerundive construction, which is to avoid a situation where a gerund would try to govern a direct object, and then we've got a gerundive of obligation when we want to express obligation and say that, something ought to be done by someone. And when we do that, we use the gerundive in agreement with the thing that ought to be done, and then we put the person on whom the obligation to do it lies, we put that person in the dative. Okay, so that's about it really. We'll just finish with a line of Horace, one of the most famous lines of Horace. I mean, Carpe Diem is a very famous one, but, you know, equally important, we feel, is Nunc est bibendum, which basically means now is for drinking, now is a good time to go and have a drink. Nunc est bibendum. And you can have fun working out exactly what that construction is, actually. Nunc est bibendum, nunc bibendum est. Now it is to be drunk, okay? Or now there is drinking, okay? Gerund and est. I mean, you can have a bit of fun actually arguing over what that construction is, but it comes in one of his poems and it's pretty clear what it means. To him, anyway, he wants to go and have a drink. Nunc est bibendum. And on that happy note, we will call it a day for now, and I will see you back here on this channel very soon.